The diced onions were sticking to the cheap plastic cutting board, and I had to scrape them up with the side of the blade. That was the first thing I noticed. The boards weren't nonstick, and Ruben, whoever Ruben was, hadn't bothered to replace them. Probably figured someone else would. It was like that, you know? Everyone assuming someone else would handle it. That's how things get broken. That's how you end up with a foreclosure notice taped to the front door. The kitchen was big, not huge, but a fully professional, industrial-sized big. Long stainless steel counters ran the length of the room. Maybe 30 feet, several walk-in coolers hummed along the back wall. The air smelled like stale grease and something vaguely floral, like someone had tried to mask the other smells with industrial cleaner. Rows of tilting steam tables were still warm from the dinner rush. It wasn't dirty, exactly, just well used. And cold. The AC was cranked, even though it was only 10 past midnight. I could see my breath misting in front of my face. I'd been at it for maybe 15 minutes, just starting on the vegetable prep, when Tam, a guy with a shaved head and a permanent look of annoyance, slapped a thick, spiral-bound logbook onto the counter next to my station. Here, he said, not looking at me. New guy's gotta read this. Management's weird about it. Then he just walked off, disappearing into the maze of the kitchen. I glanced at the logbook. It was mostly standard stuff. Temperatures logged, deliveries confirmed, equipment malfunctions noted, all in neat, precise handwriting. Then, about halfway through, the handwriting changed. It was messier, more hurried. And it wasn't a log of what had happened, it was instructions, rules, almost. The first one read, "When stationary, always position yourself so your back is against a wall or solid surface. Never stand with your back exposed to open space." I blinked. What was that supposed to mean? Some kind of safety thing? Maybe they'd had a few incidents with people tripping and falling. I pictured myself awkwardly backing up to the steel counter, trying to make it look like I wasn't paying attention to some random rule in a logbook. A little silly, honestly. The next one, do not run on the premises for any reason. If you feel the urge to run, walk faster. Running signals panic, and panic is a signal that draws attention. Okay, that was just bizarre. Who runs in a kitchen? Especially this kitchen. It felt like someone was writing a bad security protocol for a spy movie. I snorted, imagining myself sprinting through the buffet line, dodging serving spoons and trays of shrimp. The idea was so ridiculous it almost made me forget about the medical bills, Then came, if a room feels noticeably colder than the adjacent rooms, not drafty, just cold, do not enter alone. Return with another person or leave it for the next shift. That one gave me a small shiver, even though the whole kitchen was already cold. I hadn't noticed any particularly cold spots yet, but it was unnerving. It felt like someone knew this place had its oddities. Do not eat anything brought onto the premises by anyone other than yourself. Do not accept food or drink from coworkers, vendors, or visitors. Right? Because food safety. That made sense, I guess, though. Bev, the woman who showed me the walk-in cooler, had offered me a homemade cookie. I'd politely declined. But now I wondered if it was because of some unwritten rule. Probably just good manners on her part. If you feel vibrations in the floor with no identifiable equipment source, stop what you're doing and move to the designated holding area. Wait until it stops. The holding area? What holding area? I hadn't seen any designated holding area. This was getting weirder. I vaguely remembered the floor feeling a bit off when I first walked in, a subtle thrumming under my feet. I dismissed it as the building's ventilation system. If you detect specific smell, copper, sulfur, fresh earth, burnt hair, something sweet anywhere on the premises, move upwind immediately. Do not try to identify the source. Copper. That was odd. I hadn't smelled anything like that yet, but the thought of it, a metallic tang in the air, made the back of my throat tighten. Do not leave the building premises during your shift for any reason. Well, that wasn't surprising. Standard procedure, although I had been fantasizing about slipping out for a quick smoke. Forget it. If you find a clock on the premises showing a different time than the others, do not correct it. Note the time it shows, and keep that note on your person for the remainder of the shift. What? That was just strange. I hadn't noticed any clocks yet, but now I'd be looking for them, like some kind of scavenger hunt for broken timepieces. If a colleague begins specific behavior, humming the same note, staring at one spot, repeating a phrase, do not engage. Report immediately. This was starting to feel less like workplace safety and more like a really strange game. I glanced around the kitchen, half expecting to see someone exhibiting one of those behaviors. No one seemed to be humming, staring, or repeating anything, yet. Do not enter specific room, area, floor for any reason. That one just ended abruptly. No room or area specified. Just don't enter. I flipped through the rest of the logbook, hoping for clarification. Nothing. I pushed the logbook aside, trying to focus on the onions, but the rules were stuck in my head, a jumbled mess of warnings and prohibitions. It was just some weird old superstition, I told myself. Some previous employee's paranoia, a prank. Probably I needed this job, though, badly, and I wasn't about to jeopardize it by complaining about a few eccentric rules. I turned back to the cutting board, and that's when I noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible scent clinging to the air near the walk-in coolers, something sweet, like overripe fruit, but not quite. I took a shallow breath, trying to identify it, dismiss it. It was probably just the cleaning solution. It had to be, but it lingered, a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. And suddenly, the cold air felt colder. I found myself unconsciously shifting, angling my body so the stainless steel counter was at my back, just in case. The industrial dishwasher was a beast. Not in a scary way, just relentlessly efficient. A constant shuddering rumble filled the kitchen. It was punctuated by the hiss of steam and the clatter of racks being loaded and unloaded. My job was pre-wash, scraping plates, stacking them, getting as much of the big stuff off before they hit the machine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And it kept me moving, which honestly was good. Less time to think. Tonight was slow, thankfully. Usually Saturday nights were a madhouse, but apparently everyone was at the arena watching a hockey game. The buffet was half empty when I'd walked through earlier, and the kitchen reflected that. Just me, Marcus, and Connie on this side. Marcus was running the hotline, mostly just keeping things warm. Connie was in charge of desserts, a world I was grateful to avoid. She was particular about her pastries. I was working on a stack of prime rib plates. The grease clung to the porcelain even after the busboys had done their initial sweep. The smell was faint, mostly overwhelmed by the steam and the cleaning fluid. But it was there, that sweetness again. I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The hospital smell, maybe. My wife, Sarah, had spent so much time in hospitals these last few months. It was probably just a phantom scent, a trick of the mind. I scraped at a particularly stubborn bit of horseradish sauce, trying to focus on the task. The plates were stacked about 6 high, and I needed to move them to the rack by the dishwasher. It was 10 or 12 feet across the open space of the prep area. Usually Ruben was over there, coordinating the flow, but he'd taken a smoke break a while ago and hadn't returned. I glanced up, checking for Marcus or Connie. Both were occupied. Marcus was barking orders at a new busboy, and Connie was meticulously arranging miniature cheesecakes. Fine, I could handle it. I bent down, adjusted my grip on the stack, and started walking. It was a little awkward, balancing the plates, but I'd done it 100 times before. I was almost to the rack when I realized something. I hadn't really paid attention to where I was walking, and now I was completely in the middle of the room. Nothing behind me, just open space stretching back to the walk-in coolers and the supply storage. A wave of discomfort washed over me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like exposure, like being caught without a coat in a cold wind. It was irrational. I was in a kitchen, surrounded by stainless steel and tile, but the feeling persisted. It was unpleasant. Then, a scuffling sound. Not loud, but distinct, like something or someone dragging their feet across the tile floor. It came from behind me, from the open space I was facing. I froze, the stack of plates wobbling in my hands. It could have been Marcus coming to yell at the busboy, or Reuben returning from his break, but it didn't sound like either of them. It was hesitant, deliberate, slow. I took a small, shuffling step backwards, angling my body towards the stainless steel prep table. Just a slight shift, barely noticeable, but enough to put something solid at my back. The scuffling stopped, complete silence. I stood there for a beat, heart thudding against my ribs, trying to catch my breath. I told myself it was nothing. The acoustics in this place were strange. Sounds bounced around, distorted. It was probably just my imagination running wild. I was tired, stressed about the bills. Sarah. I finished moving the plates to the rack, carefully setting them down. The metal clinked loudly in the sudden quiet. My hands felt strangely slick. I wiped them on my apron, avoiding looking back at the open space. I needed to get back to scraping, get back to something, anything that felt normal. But the feeling lingered, that sense of being watched, of being vulnerable. And now I could feel a new, insistent need, a compulsion to always have something solid at my back. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was just what I did. I found myself subtly repositioning throughout the rest of my shift. Always near a counter, a wall, a cooler, anything to avoid that open feeling, and the sweet smell, though fainter now, seemed to follow me, clinging to the edges of my awareness. I noticed I was unconsciously scanning the kitchen for walls, for solid surfaces, assessing escape routes. It was a new habit, and I didn't know why I had it. But I knew, with a growing certainty, that I wasn't going to ignore it. The overnight shift was always about prep. Endless chopping, slicing, dicing, mostly vegetables, thankfully. The banquet kitchen used a ridiculous amount of broccoli, for some reason. I was working on a mountain of it, breaking it down into florets. It was monotonous, but better than cleaning the grill. The smell of burnt sugar and grease from the dessert station clung to everything, even after they'd scrubbed down the surfaces. It was a sickly sweet smell, but not the same as well, not the other thing. This was just the casino trying to smell appealing. I'd gotten into a rhythm, knife moving steadily, the sound a dull thud against the cutting board. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant, irritating drone. I was thinking about Sarah, trying to picture her face. She'd been sleeping most of the day, exhaustion from the last chemo treatment finally catching up with her. I wished I could be there with her, but the bills weren't going to pay themselves. I needed the hours. I needed the money. Even this awful, repetitive work was a lifeline. Reuben came wandering back from his break, smelling like stale cigarettes and regret. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me for a moment. "Still at the broccoli, huh? You're a machine, Kieran." He didn't offer to help, just stood there, observing. I nodded, kept chopping. "Slow night so far," he added. "Good. Maybe we'll actually get out on time." I barely registered his words. My focus was on keeping the pace steady, the florets uniform. It was a small thing, a way to exert some control in a situation where I had none. Then I heard it, a crash. Not a shattering crash, but a dull thud, like something heavy falling onto a carpeted surface. It came from the main kitchen area beyond the swinging doors. I glanced up instinctively. Reuben was already moving towards the doors, his face creased with annoyance. "Probably just one of the busboys dropping a tray," he muttered. But the sound, it hadn't sounded like a tray. It had sounded heavier, more solid, like furniture. Then another sound, a rapid scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor, and then a shout. It wasn't a yell of pain, more of a startled cry. It was Crane, I realized. Crane, the night cook. He rarely spoke, but his voice was unmistakable. My stomach lurched. I wanted to run, to see what was happening, to make sure everyone was okay. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to move, to investigate. But then that fragmented memory surfaced, something from the logbook. Not a specific rule number, just the idea of it. Something about not running, about drawing attention, about panic. I remembered the gist of it. Do not run on the premises for any reason. If you feel the urge to run, walk faster. It wasn't perfectly clear, the words were hazy, but the underlying message was undeniable. Running was bad, it signaled something, it attracted something. I dismissed it as ridiculous. a leftover security measure from some long-forgotten incident. Probably just a clumsy busboy and a startled cook. But the feeling persisted. That primal urge to flee, it was overwhelming. I gripped the handle of the knife tighter, my knuckles white. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, and another. I didn't run. I didn't even break into a jog. I simply walked as quickly as I could without actually running. Each step felt deliberate, unnatural, like moving through thick mud. Reuben had already pushed through the swinging doors, disappearing into the main kitchen. I followed, maintaining a brisk walk, my eyes scanning the room. It was mostly empty. Crane was standing near the dessert station, staring at the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. And there it was, a small antique rocking chair, sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. It wasn't one of the casino's chairs, not the kind they used in the lobby or the buffet area. This was old, dark wood, intricately carved. It looked like something you'd find in an antique store, or in someone's living room. It hadn't been there a few minutes ago. I was certain of it. I'd walked through this space just before starting on the broccoli. There hadn't been a rocking chair. Crane just kept staring at it, speechless. I looked around for someone who'd put it there, a prank, maybe, but there was no one, just the two of us, and the unsettling presence of the chair. It wasn't the chair itself that bothered me. It was the wrongness of it, the impossibility of it. It was as if it had simply appeared. I forced myself to keep walking, to avoid staring directly at it. I needed to get back to the broccoli, back to something normal. But I couldn't shake the image of the chair, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite doing everything right, despite resisting the urge to run, something had seen me, something had noticed. A subtle pressure behind my eyes, a coldness that settled low in my chest. It was a different kind of discomfort than I'd felt before. This felt knowing. I returned to the broccoli, my hands trembling slightly. The sweet smell, the one that wasn't the casino's attempt at pleasantness, was stronger now. It clung to the air, a cloying, suffocating sweetness. I looked down at the green florets, and they suddenly seemed wrong, too bright, too perfect. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wouldn't be able to look at a rocking chair the same way again. I went back to the broccoli. It felt important to get back to the broccoli. Something about the repetitive motion, the clean, crisp snap of the florets separating from the stalk, grounded me. It was a small, manageable task in a place that was rapidly becoming anything but. I filled another plastic tub, stacking it neatly with the green pieces. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant irritating drone. It was quiet, too quiet, even for the overnight shift. Bev was supposed to come in and start on the potatoes around 11. I glanced at the clock. 10:47. Still a few minutes. I tried to focus on the broccoli, on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to the rocking chair. It was just a chair, an old chair. Someone had probably brought it in as a joke, maybe Tam or one of the maintenance guys. They were always pulling pranks. It was unsettling, sure, but ultimately harmless, probably. I finished the tub and started on another, trying to ignore the lingering sweetness in the air. It was like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic. I couldn't quite place it. I wiped my brow with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of green. It was getting warm in here, despite the industrial-sized air conditioning units thrumming in the ceiling. Or maybe it was just me. The stress, the worry about Sarah. The medical bills piling up. It was all weighing on me, making me more sensitive to everything. Bev shuffled in, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a thermos clutched in her hand. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. "You could say that," I replied, forcing a smile. "Found a rocking chair in the middle of the kitchen." Bev snorted. "Clark and his shenanigans. He's been collecting antique junk again. Probably thought it'd brighten the place up." "It just seemed out of place," I said, still unsettled, like it didn't belong. "He's got a weird sense of humor, that one. Don't let it bother you." She walked towards the potato station, already unwrapping a bag of russets. "So, how's Sarah doing?" "Same as always," I said, my voice tight. "Good days and bad days. Tell her I'm thinking of her. She started peeling potatoes, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the kitchen. Hey, could you grab the stock from the walk-in? It's just past the dish pit. Sure, I said. I grabbed an empty stock pot and headed towards the back of the kitchen. The walk-in was always colder than the rest of the kitchen, but usually it was a refreshing kind of cold, a damp, refrigerated chill. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stopped. It wasn't the temperature that hit me first, although it was drastically colder than usual. It wasn't the darkness, although the walk-in was dimly lit at best. It was the emptiness of the air. It felt thin, almost absent, and the cold. It wasn't a drafty cold. It was a static, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into my bones. My breath hitched, forming a visible cloud in front of my face. I hadn't noticed the temperature change gradually. It was an immediate, absolute drop. Something about it triggered a memory, a fragmented echo of the logbook. Something about cold, and not going alone. A warning. I couldn't recall the exact words, just the feeling of dread that had accompanied it. My skin prickled. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. I didn't think. I barely registered the impulse. I simply backed away from the doorway, closing the metal door behind me with a soft thud. I didn't need to see what was inside. I didn't need to investigate. I just knew I shouldn't be in there. Not alone. Bev looked up as I returned, stockpot still empty. Everything all right? Just really cold in there, I said, my voice a little shaky. I think the refrigeration might be malfunctioning. Maybe we should get Crane to take a look. Bev shrugged. Could be. It's been acting up lately, I'll tell Marcus. She went back to her potatoes, seemingly unconcerned. I stood there for a moment, leaning against a stainless steel counter, my heart rate slowly returning to normal. It was just a faulty refrigeration unit. That's all it was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something unseen. The sweet smell seemed to have intensified, clinging to the back of my throat, and I knew, with a growing sense of unease, that I would be avoiding that walk-in for the rest of my shift. I would ask someone else to get the stock, always. The cold lingered, settling under my skin like a premonition. I felt a compulsion to check the rocking chair again, but resisted. It was enough to know there were places in this kitchen I shouldn't be alone in. Some places deserved to be left undisturbed. I was peeling potatoes, a mountain of russets, destined for mashed potatoes, fries, home fries, whatever the lunch crowd demanded. It was mindless work, the kind that let my thoughts drift. Usually they drifted to Ren, to the bills, to the rocking chair. Still half finished in the garage collecting dust. Today, though, I was trying to focus on the potatoes, on the rhythm of the peeler, on keeping my fingers from slipping. The kitchen was quiet for a graveyard shift. Bev was humming along to some old country song on the radio, methodically portioning out the breakfast sausage. Marcus was nowhere to be seen, probably in his office doing paperwork. It was a slower night than usual, which was a small blessing. Fewer orders meant less prep, less stress. I'd been at it for 2 hours, and the pile of peeled potatoes was slowly but surely diminishing. I'd managed to get into a groove, a sort of meditative state where the repetitive motion was almost soothing. Then Rowan came over, balancing a chipped mug. He was new, barely a week in, a skinny kid trying to look tougher than he was. He offered me the mug. Coffee, man, fresh pot. You look like you could use it. I automatically reached for it, black. Just the way I liked it. I hadn't even thought about wanting coffee, but suddenly the idea was incredibly appealing. The smell was good, strong and bitter. Thanks, Rowan, I said, taking a sip. It was hot, almost scalding, but good, really good. And then it hit me. A little flicker of something. A memory. Not of a rule exactly, but of a feeling. A warning. Something about not accepting things, not taking anything from anyone. It wasn't clear, just a prickle of unease at the back of my neck, a knot tightening in my stomach. It felt absurd, of course. Rowan was just being friendly. A little caffeine never hurt anyone, probably just tired. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. I took another sip of the coffee, forcing myself to relax. It was just coffee. Rowan meant well. I was letting my anxieties get the better of me. The bills, the hospital, the cold and the walk-in, it was all getting to me. I needed to shake it off. I needed to focus on the potatoes. But the feeling persisted, a growing sense of wrongness. And I remembered, with more clarity this time, a phrase from the logbook. Something about outside sources, about keeping things separate, about not allowing anything in. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the implication was clear. It wasn't about germs or hygiene. It was something else, something protective. I had a sudden, desperate need to call Ren, to hear her voice, to make sure she was okay. It wasn't a normal check-in. It was a frantic urge, a conviction that something was wrong, that I needed to know she was safe, right now. But I couldn't. I couldn't just stop prepping potatoes and call her in the middle of the night. Marcus would have a fit, and I couldn't explain why I was suddenly so panicked. I forced myself to finish the coffee, the warmth doing little to quell the rising anxiety. The liquid felt heavy, coating my tongue with a strange metallic aftertaste. I focused on the potatoes, peeling faster now, almost frantically. I had to get back to work. I had to appear normal. Bev glanced over. "Everything okay, Kieran? You're peeling those like you're trying to win a prize." "Just trying to get them done," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. The urge to call Ren intensified. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a physical ache, a tightening in my chest. I pictured her asleep in our bed, the one we'd argued over buying because it was too expensive. I imagined her small, frail form, still recovering from the chemo. I needed to know she was breathing. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. I knew she would be asleep, but I needed to confirm it. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to know. I told myself I could sneak away for just a minute, just one quick call. It wouldn't hurt anyone, but I knew I couldn't. The logbook, the cold walk-in, the unsettling feeling, it all pointed to the same thing. I couldn't break the invisible barrier. I couldn't risk inviting something in. I swallowed hard, forcing down the panic. I continued peeling potatoes, my hands trembling slightly. The rhythmic scraping of the peeler against the potatoes was the only sound in the kitchen, besides Bev's quiet humming. But the image of Ren, vulnerable and alone, remained burned in my mind, and with every potato I peeled, the guilt grew heavier, a cold weight settling in my stomach. I hadn't called her. I hadn't checked, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if something had happened. I finished the last potato, my hands raw and aching. The pile of peels was enormous, a testament to my wasted time, and Ren was still unreachable, shrouded in a silence I had deliberately chosen. The rocking chair would have to wait another night. The industrial dishwasher was a beast, a constant shuddering roar that vibrated through the floor, through my teeth. I was loading it with sheet pans, scraping off the remnants of breakfast, scrambled eggs, congealed gravy, the sad gray remains of biscuits. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a rhythm, a predictable, mindless rhythm that I needed right then. Ren had a doctor's appointment today, a follow-up after the last round of chemotherapy. I hadn't slept well, replaying every possible scenario in my head. Good news, bad news, no change. It all felt like waiting for a verdict. The metal of the pans was cold against my palms, even through the thick rubber gloves. I tried to focus on the task, on the methodical stacking and scraping. Reuben was on the grill, flipping omelets with a practiced flick of the wrist. The smell of cooking bacon mingled with the disinfectant used to clean the counters. It was a peculiar smell, that combination, comforting and sterile all at once. I wondered if Ren could smell it when I got home, clinging to my clothes. She always said I smelled like breakfast, even when I'd been doing something else entirely. I'd been trying to finish the rocking chair. The wood was sanded smooth, the joints fitted perfectly, but I hadn't been able to bring myself to apply the varnish. It felt pointless, like building something beautiful while everything else was falling apart. I kept picturing her in it, rocking back and forth, a small smile on her face, but the image always felt fragile, on the verge of shattering. Then I felt it, a tremor, low and subtle, running through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the dishwasher. The dishwasher was a constant vibration, a background hum. This was different, deeper, more resonant. It felt like it was coming from the floor itself. I paused, holding a sheet pan halfway to the rack. I glanced at Ruben, but he didn't seem to notice anything. He was humming along to the radio, completely oblivious. It grew slightly stronger, a faint thrumming that tickled my feet. Maybe it was just construction nearby. The casino was always expanding, adding new wings, new attractions. They'd been doing work on the parking garage last week. It could be that, a reasonable explanation. I resumed loading the dishwasher, trying to ignore the persistent vibration. It was probably just my imagination, fueled by lack of sleep and worry. It had been happening a lot lately, little phantom sensations. But it didn't stop. It built, not quickly, but steadily. It wasn't a shaking, not exactly, more like a sustained, low-frequency hum that resonated through my bones. And then I remembered something I'd read in the logbook, tucked away amidst the cleaning schedules and inventory lists. Something about vibrations, a rule, something about stopping what you were doing if you felt it. A designated area. It was vague, fragmented in my memory. Something about structural integrity? I couldn't recall the exact wording. The holding area was at the far end of the kitchen, a small windowless room used for storing cleaning supplies. It had a reinforced concrete floor and a heavy steel door. It felt ominous, even in normal circumstances, but the rule, or my recollection of it, was insistent. Something about not being near equipment when it happened. And I was standing right next to a monstrous vibrating dishwasher. I glanced at Ruben again, still oblivious, still flipping omelets. I told myself it was nothing, a quirk of the building, a faulty pipe. But the vibration was definitely getting stronger. I could feel it in my teeth now, a faint buzzing sensation. I didn't want to look like an idiot, abandoning my post over a phantom tremor. Bev would see. Xander would make a joke. I could already feel the embarrassment creeping up my neck. But the memory of the logbook wouldn't leave me alone. The feeling that the rule existed for a reason I didn't understand, but a reason nonetheless. I set the sheet pan down, the clatter echoing in the kitchen. Ruben glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "Everything all right, Kieran?" "Just checking something," I mumbled, already walking towards the holding area. My legs felt heavy, leaden. Every step felt like a betrayal of common sense. I was abandoning my job over a feeling, a ridiculous, unfounded feeling, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was profoundly wrong. The holding area smelled of bleach and disinfectant, a harsh chemical odor that stung my nostrils. I closed the steel door behind me, the heavy clang echoing in the small room. The vibration was still there, but muffled now, less intense. I leaned against the cool concrete wall, trying to slow my breathing. I decided to count, to give it a definitive amount of time. If it stopped within 5 minutes, I'd go back to the dishwasher, apologize to Ruben, and pretend it never happened. If it continued past 5 minutes, well, I didn't want to think about that. 1, 2, 3. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity. 4, 5, 6. The vibration persisted, unwavering. 7, 8, 9. It was actually increasing again. 10, 11, 12. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a comfortable position. 13, 14. The metallic taste I'd thought had faded from the coffee earlier returned, coating the back of my throat. 15, 16, 17. I kept counting. There was nothing else to do. The vibration continued, relentless and unwavering. After 20 minutes, my legs ached. After 30, my mind began to wander. I thought about Ren, about the rocking chair, about the medical bills piling up on the kitchen table. I thought about the absurdity of the situation, standing in a supply closet, counting seconds because of a feeling in my feet. After 45 minutes, the vibration finally stopped. Just stopped, abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a long moment, listening for any sign of it returning, but there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I opened the steel door and stepped back into the kitchen. Ruben was gone. Xander was loading the dishwasher. He didn't look at me. He just nodded and continued working. The air felt different, thicker, and the smell of bacon, so comforting just an hour ago, now felt nauseatingly sweet. I noticed a thin layer of dust coating every surface. A dust that hadn't been there before. I'd spent nearly an hour in that room. An hour that no one else seemed to have noticed was missing, and I had the unsettling feeling that, somehow, time hadn't passed the same way for me as it had for them. I was stripping the stems off strawberries, a mindless task that at least kept my hands busy. It was quiet, thankfully. Xander was still at the dishwasher, a mechanical rhythm of clangs and hisses. Bev was stacking plates, moving with a practiced efficiency that bordered on robotic. The overnight crew wasn't known for its conversation. It was just getting through, each of us with our own reasons for being there when everyone else was asleep. The strawberries were surprisingly fragrant, a bright, sweet smell that cut through the usual stale grease and cleaning chemicals. It was a small thing, but it felt good, something normal, something real. I tried to focus on the feel of the hulls snapping off, the small burst of juice when I pinched them. Ren liked strawberries. She'd put them in everything, cereal, yogurt, even salads. I hadn't bought her any in weeks. They were too expensive. Then I smelled it. Not the strawberries, something else. Underneath it, a cloying sweetness but rotten, like overripe fruit left in the sun too long, and something metallic. Not the sharp tang of iron, but something duller, heavier, like a mouthful of old pennies. I paused, my hand hovering over the bowl of berries. It was probably just the garbage. They hadn't taken it out last night, and the kitchen was starting to smell. I'd complained to Connie, but she'd just shrugged and said it was Marcus's job. Marcus hadn't shown up for his shift. It wasn't unusual, people called out. It was a casino kitchen, after all. Turnover was insane. I dismissed it, pinched off another strawberry hull, and tried to focus on the task at hand. But the smell persisted, growing stronger with each breath. It wasn't coming from the garbage. It was closer. I could feel a slight pressure in my sinuses, a subtle tightening in my chest. It wasn't overpowering, but it was undeniably there. It tugged at something deep inside me, a primal urge to locate the source. I started to turn my head, scanning the kitchen. That's when I remembered. A fragment of the logbook buried somewhere in the back of my mind. Something about smells, not just any smell. A specific kind, sweet, metallic, and moving upwind. I couldn't recall the exact wording. It felt like grasping at smoke, but the image was vivid enough. A warning, a prohibition. I hadn't even registered which direction I was facing when I started to move. I was already turning, taking a step towards the back of the kitchen, towards the service entrance that led to the loading dock. The loading dock smelled like diesel and damp concrete, and it was almost certainly where the smell was coming from. It was the logical place to look. Then a sound. Not loud, but persistent. A high-pitched whine, almost inaudible, like a mosquito buzzing near your ear. It seemed to be coming from my left, from the direction of the walk-in refrigerators. The cold spot, a shiver ran down my spine, a reflexive response to the memory of that sudden, oppressive chill. I froze mid-step. I looked towards the refrigerators, but nothing seemed amiss. The metal doors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The condensation dripped steadily onto the tiled floor. But the whine continued, growing slightly louder, and the smell it hadn't dissipated. In fact, it seemed to be shifting. The sweetness was receding, replaced by a sharper, more acrid note, something burning. I forced myself to turn away from the service entrance, pivoting on my heel. It felt wrong, counterintuitive. Every instinct screamed at me to find the source of the smell, to identify the problem. But the logbook, that vague, unsettling memory, held me back. And the whine, that relentless, irritating whine. I took a step away from the loading dock, towards the dishwashing area. Xander didn't even look up. He just kept loading plates, his movements precise and mechanical. The smell seemed to lessen with each step, becoming less intrusive, less urgent. I walked, forcing myself to maintain a steady pace, ignoring the nagging feeling that I was abandoning something important. I reached the far end of the kitchen, near the dry storage room. The smell was almost gone now, a faint trace lingering in the air. The whine had faded to a barely perceptible hum. I stopped, leaning against a stack of flour sacks, catching my breath. Bev glanced over, her expression unreadable. Everything all right, Kieran? Just needed some air, I said, my voice sounding strangely hollow. I looked back towards the service entrance. It was just a doorway, framed by stainless steel, but for a moment I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows. A flicker of darkness, a distortion in the air. But it was gone before I could focus on it, and the smell, it was definitely gone. I had the distinct impression that if I went near that door again, I would be making a terrible mistake. I had the feeling the smell wasn't gone, just waiting. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wouldn't be able to ignore it next time. I also knew, with equal certainty, that I would have to move upwind. I just didn't know which way the wind was blowing. The peaches were a pain. Every single one needed to be individually sliced, pitted, and tossed in that lemon sugar solution. It was one of those tasks they saved for overnight, when nobody cared about presentation, only volume. Hundreds of peaches destined for the buffet's fruit salad, a sea of orange monotony. I worked slowly, deliberately, trying to find a rhythm. Slice, pit, drop, slice, pit, drop. It was almost meditative if it wasn't for the stickiness. Peach juice coated my hands, my apron, the countertop. I'd been at it for nearly an hour, the only sound the whir of the industrial fan overhead and the occasional clatter from Xander still methodically tackling the dishes. He hadn't said a word since the coffee incident, probably for the best. I avoided looking his way. It wasn't the coffee itself, I figured, it was just the timing. Rowan offering it right after I'd been thinking about things falling apart. Just a coincidence. Still, I hadn't been able to shake the image of Rowan's smile. Too wide, maybe. Too knowing. Bev was humming along to some old country song on the radio, restocking the bread station. Everything felt normal, mundane, exactly what I needed. I needed to just get through the shift, get a paycheck, and try to forget about everything else. The bills, the house, Sarah's appointments, the rocking chair still unfinished in the garage. I pictured her sitting in it, a small smile on her face. Maybe I could work on it tomorrow. Maybe. Then the alarm, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through everything. Not the fire alarm, thankfully. It was a panic button, a small, inconspicuous device near the cashier's station. Someone was in trouble. My first instinct, I'll admit, was to ignore it, to keep slicing peaches, to disappear into the rhythm of the task. The logbook, the rules, they weren't just about smells and cold spots. They were about avoiding involvement, about staying put. I glanced at Xander, who hadn't even flinched. He continued loading plates, oblivious. The alarm continued to blare. And then, over the speakers, a voice. Connie, the overnight cashier, her voice tight with fear. Someone just tried to rob the casino. They're in the parking garage. My hands froze mid-slice. The peach felt slick and heavy in my grip. I remembered the rule, or what I remembered of it. Something about not leaving. Something about boundaries, about things staying contained. It wasn't a clear memory, more of a feeling, a deep, visceral sense that crossing a line would be bad, really bad. I looked towards the back door, the one leading to the employee entrance and ultimately the parking garage. It was a direct line to the chaos. I almost convinced myself it wasn't my problem. That security would handle it, that the police were already on their way. It was a casino, for God's sake. They had security protocols for everything. But Connie's voice, the sheer terror in it, kept replaying in my head. And then, the thought of Sarah. What if something happened to her? What if I wasn't there? The thought propelled me forward. It was a stupid, irrational fear, I knew, but it was enough. I shoved the peach aside, ignoring the sticky juice that splattered onto my apron. I had to stay. That was it. I had to stay inside. The rule wasn't a suggestion, more of an imperative. I turned away from the back door, away from the alarm, and walked towards the walk-in refrigerator. It was the furthest point from the employee entrance, the most secure location in the kitchen, and as I walked, I noticed something, a subtle shift in the air, a tingling sensation on my skin. The fluorescent lights flickered, not violently, but just enough to be unsettling. I reached the refrigerator, bracing myself for the familiar chill. But it wasn't the cold I felt. It was a stillness, an unnatural silence. The hum of the compressor was gone. The dripping water had stopped. Everything was perfectly, eerily quiet. I leaned against the cold metal door, trying to regulate my breathing. Then I saw it. Reflected in the stainless steel surface of the refrigerator door. A figure, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Not Xander, not Bev, not anyone I recognized. It was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the dim light of the hallway. Tall and slender, almost impossibly so. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I stared at the reflection, searching for any trace of it. Nothing. Just my own face, pale and drawn, staring back at me. The compressor kicked back on, the hum filling the silence. The dripping water resumed its steady rhythm. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. I hadn't imagined it. I felt it. The weight of being watched, the lingering coldness on the back of my neck. I slowly backed away from the refrigerator, my hands shaking. I hadn't left the kitchen, I hadn't broken the rule. But something had come to me, and I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that this wasn't over. The peaches, the alarm, the silhouette, it was all connected, and I had a terrible feeling that compliance hadn't protected me. It had just delayed the inevitable. I was stripping the cores out of romaine lettuce, a mindless task that at least kept my hands busy. The kitchen was quiet, thankfully. The worst of the breakfast rush was over, and the lunch prep hadn't really kicked in yet. Just me and the endless mountain of lettuce, bathed in the harsh, humming fluorescent light. It was a good quiet, though, not the unsettling stillness from earlier. More normal. I needed normal. I kept glancing at the clock above the dishwashing station. 2:53 a.m. Another hour and a little bit until my break. Sarah was probably still asleep, which was good. She'd been sleeping more these days, a heavy, exhausted sleep. The medication, the lingering effects of the chemo, it all took a toll. I was trying to finish the rocking chair, a small victory in the face of everything else. I'd gotten the runners done, the curved pieces that supported the arms, just needed to assemble it, sand it, and stain it. But finding the energy, the focus, that was the hard part. Bev was supposed to come in at 3 to start on the fruit platters. I was almost looking forward to it. Even Bev's grumbling was preferable to the silence. I'd been trying to avoid Xander since the robbery, not because of anything he'd done exactly, just his eyes. They'd looked hollow, vacant, almost like he hadn't been fully present. It was probably just exhaustion. Everyone was tired. I rounded the corner into the dry storage room to grab another case of romaine. It was a small room, mostly shelves stacked high with canned goods and boxes of cereal. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows, and that's when I saw it. A clock. Not one of the digital clocks that were everywhere else in the kitchen, standardized and synchronized. This was an old-fashioned analog clock, the kind you'd see in a diner from the 50s, with a chrome frame and a cracked glass face. It was hanging on the wall near the back, almost hidden behind a stack of flour sacks, and it was showing 3:17 a.m. It couldn't be right. It was only 2:56. I checked my phone. 2:56 and 18 seconds. The digital clock above the dishwashing station confirmed it. 2:56. This thing was off, way off. I probably shouldn't even be noticing it. Just some old junk someone left in the storage room. Probably doesn't even work. But then I remembered something. A fragment of a rule. Something about time, about not correcting things, about things being out of sync. It wasn't a clear thought, more like a pressure building behind my eyes. A warning, a feeling that messing with it would be wrong. A small voice in my head insisted that I should leave it alone. I almost laughed it off. A broken clock. Seriously? I was letting this place get to me. The stress of Sarah's illness, the mounting bills, the weirdness of the overnight shift. It was all starting to feel like too much. I was seeing things, imagining rules. I reached for the clock, intending to just take it down, to get rid of it. But my hand stopped inches from the chrome frame. The pressure in my head intensified. A wave of nausea washed over me. I remembered the feeling from the walk-in, the awful stillness, the sense of being watched. The rule, whatever it was, felt urgent. I pulled my hand back. I didn't need to fix it. I didn't need to know why it was there. I just needed to leave it alone. I grabbed a small notepad from my apron pocket and a pen. Without thinking, I wrote 317, just those 2 digits. I folded the note into a tiny square and tucked it into the breast pocket of my chef's coat, close to my heart. It felt important. like carrying a small, cold stone. Bev walked in as I was leaving the storage room, already peeling oranges. She didn't say anything, just nodded in my direction. I forced a smile. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah, fine," I said, too quickly. "Just getting back to the lettuce." I walked back to my station, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The lettuce felt different now, rougher against my skin. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder, and I couldn't stop thinking about that clock, about what had happened at 3:17, about what I had just avoided. I kept touching the small square of paper in my pocket, a cold, hard reminder of a time I didn't know, and a warning I couldn't ignore. The kitchen smelled faintly of citrus and something else, something I couldn't place, something unsettling. It wasn't the sweetness from before. This was different, dull, like old dust, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the night was far from over. I was sorting potatoes. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? After everything, after the clock and the smell and everything, I was sitting on a stool, picking through a 50-pound sack of russets, tossing the bad ones into a metal bin. It was quiet, thankfully. The early morning rush was over. The breakfast crowd mostly gone. Just me and the potatoes. It was peaceful. The air was thick with the smell of starch and bleach. The floor was cool under my boots, a little damp. I'd scrubbed down the prep tables earlier, trying to get ahead. Anything to feel like I was actually accomplishing something instead of just existing. The medical bills were still there, still growing, still threatening to swallow everything we owned. I needed to get through this shift. Get through all the shifts, really. Bev was at the slicer, humming. She always hummed, usually some old country tune, something I vaguely recognized from my childhood. It was irritating sometimes, but mostly just Bev. She was a fixture in this kitchen, had been here for 20 years, she said. Knew every nook and cranny, every broken tile, every temperamental burner. She was a good egg, even if she did talk to the tomatoes. But this wasn't country, it was a single note. A high-pitched, wavering tone, repeated over and over. It didn't fit Bev. She wasn't the type for minimalist compositions. It was off. I glanced over. She hadn't changed her expression. Still focused on the slicer, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. But her eyes, they were fixed on a spot just above the stainless steel counter, not looking at anything, just staring. My stomach tightened, that feeling again. Not quite nausea, more like a cold knot twisting inside. I remembered something then, a line from that document, something about colleagues, about noticing changes, about not engaging. If a colleague begins specific behavior, do not engage, report immediately. The specifics were hazy, lost in the swirling panic of the first few days, but the gist was clear enough. Don't interact, don't acknowledge. It was probably nothing. Bev was tired. She worked double shifts sometimes, trying to make ends meet. Maybe she was just zoning out, lost in thought. It wasn't like her to be quiet, but people get tired. People space out. It didn't mean anything. I could just ask her if she was okay. A simple, friendly check-in. But the humming didn't stop. The unwavering gaze didn't shift. The knot in my stomach tightened another notch. That feeling, that cold stillness, intensified. I knew somehow that just checking in was the wrong move, that it would be a break, a crack in something fragile. I forced myself to look away. Back at the potatoes, a bad one, a soft spot starting to rot. I tossed it in the bin, another, and another. I tried to focus on the task, on the weight of the potatoes in my hands, on the rhythmic thud of the bad ones hitting metal, but the humming burrowed into my brain. The image of Bev's blank stare burned behind my eyelids. I needed to tell someone. Marcus, maybe? He was the head chef, usually pretty level-headed, but the document had said, report immediately. Immediately to who? It hadn't specified. Just report. And the thought of explaining this, of trying to articulate the wrongness of it all, felt impossible. They'd think I was losing it. Or worse, that I was making it up, trying to get out of work. I couldn't risk that. Not with everything hanging in the balance. I glanced up again. Bev hadn't moved. The humming continued. Relentless. Her eyes hadn't blinked. I stood up, abandoning the potatoes. I had to get away. I had to get a clear head. I started walking towards the walk-in, intending to just breathe, to cool down, to regroup. But as I passed the dishwashing station, I saw Ursa. She was normally a whirlwind of efficiency, clattering plates and yelling orders. But she was standing perfectly still, her back to me, staring at the floor drain. And I realized with a sickening lurch that the smell was back. Not the cloying sweetness this time. Something else. Something sharper, more metallic. It was coming from the drain. I stopped. My throat felt constricted. The smell rule. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just my imagination. It was connected. Everything was connected. I turned around, back towards Bev, back towards the humming, back towards the unsettling stillness. I couldn't go near the drain. I couldn't investigate. But my wife, she'd texted me earlier. A simple message, asking if I'd remembered to call the pharmacy about her medication refill. I'd meant to, but I'd gotten caught up in the chaos. I needed to call them now, before they closed, before she ran out. The pharmacy was on the other side of the kitchen, right past Bev. I stood there, frozen. The rule. The medication. My wife. I walked back to my potatoes. I sat back down on the stool. I started sorting again, deliberately, methodically, ignoring the humming, ignoring the stare, ignoring the growing icy dread. I would call the pharmacy later, after my shift. I would call them when things were calmer. I kept sorting, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in my gut, that there would be consequences, that something important hadn't gotten done, something my wife needed, and I hadn't done a thing to stop it. The sack of potatoes felt heavier now, the weight of them pressing down on me, a physical manifestation of the choice I'd just made. The humming continued, a monotonous drone that filled the silence and echoed the hollow ache in my chest. I was peeling carrots, just mountains of carrots. The pre-shift rush had died down hours ago, and the kitchen had settled into that weird humming quiet that only exists when you're the only one awake. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, not exactly. It felt watched. I tried to focus on the carrots, on the rhythmic scrape of the peeler, the orange curls piling up on the stainless steel counter. It was a mindless task, and I needed mindless. I needed to not think about the bills, or my wife, or the way Ursa had been staring into that drain. Bev was still at her station, but she hadn't moved since I'd walked past her earlier, still humming that same flat note. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a faulty fluorescent light. I glanced over. She hadn't changed her expression, hadn't blinked, hadn't even seemed to breathe. It was unnerving, but I told myself she was just lost in thought. People get zoned out, especially on the overnight. Maybe she was thinking about something difficult. Maybe she had kids, or a sick parent. It was probably nothing. I finished the carrots and started on the celery. This was supposed to be a temporary job just until we got back on our feet, just until the medical bills were under control. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and right now, steady was everything. I'd spent too long bouncing from gig to gig, trying to make ends meet. Woodworking was a passion, but it didn't pay the bills. The rocking chair was gathering dust in the garage, another reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Then I noticed the door. It wasn't a door I'd seen before, or rather, I hadn't registered it before. It was tucked away in the corner of the kitchen, behind the walk-in, almost hidden by a stack of empty sheet pans. It was a plain metal door, no windows, no signage, just a simple industrial-looking door, and it was slightly ajar. I paused, celery stick halfway to the cutting board. It didn't make any sense. I'd been back here dozens of times, unloading deliveries, taking out the trash. I would have noticed a door. I should have noticed a door, but I hadn't, and now, here it was. I remembered something, a fragment of a conversation from my first week. Ruben, showing me around, a quick, almost casual warning, something about a restricted area, something about not going in. I couldn't recall the exact words, just a feeling, a sense of unease. It felt like a rule, but a rule whispered, not written. It probably led to the boiler room or the electrical panel. Some maintenance area. Nothing to worry about, but still, that nagging feeling. It was probably just standard procedure, keeping unauthorized personnel out of sensitive areas. I was just a temporary prep cook. I didn't need to be poking around where I didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it. It was late. I was tired. My brain was playing tricks on me. I went back to the celery, forcing myself to concentrate on the crunch of the knife, the smell of the vegetable. But the door was in my peripheral vision, a dark rectangle in the corner of my eye. It felt like it was pulling at me. Then I remembered the words, or what I thought were the words. Do not enter that area. That was it, vague, but firm. And the feeling that came with it was stronger now, not fear exactly, more like wrongness. A deep, visceral sense that something bad would happen if I went through that door. I glanced around the kitchen. Empty, silent, except for Bev's humming. It felt colder now, too. Not the static chill of the walk-in, but a creeping coldness that seemed to seep into my bones, and the air smelled different, beneath the usual smells of bleach and stale food. There was something else. Something faint, but undeniably present. Something like dust and decay. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know. I had to see what was behind that door. It was irrational. I knew I should just finish prepping the vegetables and stay out of trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring it would be worse. That something was waiting for me on the other side. I put down the knife. I wiped my hands on my apron, and I walked towards the door. It creaked open easily, revealing a narrow, unlit hallway. The smell of dust and decay was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The hallway was long and dark, the only light coming from the kitchen behind me. I could feel the coldness intensifying, clinging to my skin. The walls were bare concrete, stained with moisture, and the air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I walked slowly, cautiously, my hand outstretched, feeling for a light switch. There wasn't one. I kept walking, deeper and deeper into the darkness. The humming from the kitchen faded behind me, replaced by a faint, rhythmic dripping sound. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a single light bulb, flickering weakly, and beneath the light bulb, a small metal desk, and on the desk, a single object. A rocking chair. It wasn't finished. The wood was rough, unfinished. The runners were uneven. But it was unmistakably a rocking chair. And it was identical, down to the smallest detail, to the one I was building for my wife. I stopped dead. My mouth went dry. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It wasn't possible. I took a step closer, then another. The rocking chair seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if it weren't quite real, and then I noticed something else. Etched into the wood of the chair in small, precise letters were two words. Don't finish. The walkout was normal. Marcus was stacking bus tubs, humming something tuneless. Kay was wiping down the drink station, her face set in that permanent, pinched expression. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said anything. I swiped my card, walked through the double doors and into the pre-dawn gray. The air hit different. It was cooler, cleaner. It smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust, not grease and stale sugar. I dug my phone out of my pocket and thumbed through the contacts until I found Sarah's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I left a message, mumbled something about being done, about picking up groceries. I didn't mention the chair. I didn't mention anything. What was there to say? I drove home slowly, keeping to the right lane. I found myself checking the rearview mirror constantly, not for cars, but for something else. A shadow, a distortion, a feeling. It was stupid. Just exhaustion, I told myself. It had been a long shift, a very long shift. I even slowed down when I passed the diner just to glance at the parking lot. It was empty. Good. Sarah was already up, making coffee. She looked tired, thinner. The bags under her eyes were darker than I remembered. She didn't ask how my night was. We hadn't asked each other in weeks, just a quiet acknowledgement of shared exhaustion and worry. I poured myself a cup black and sat at the kitchen table. I tried to focus on the newspaper, on the foreclosure notices, on the estimated cost of the new medication her doctor recommended. I couldn't. My gaze kept drifting to the corner of the room, to the space where I'd been trying to build the rocking chair before everything fell apart. The wood was still there, stacked neatly, but the tools were put away. I hadn't touched them since the other chair. I caught myself straightening the edge of the newspaper, then immediately correcting it when I realized it wasn't quite parallel with the table. I hadn't always done that. I'd never really paid attention to the precise alignment of things before. It was calming, somehow, to get things right. I went back to work the next night, and the next. It wasn't a sustainable solution, I knew. The money barely covered the interest on the mortgage, let alone the principal. But it was something. And it was quiet, and it was rule-bound. I found myself almost efficient, moving through the kitchen with a strange, mechanical precision. I avoided eye contact. I kept my back to the wall whenever possible. I refused any offers of food or drink, even from Ruben, who'd started bringing in homemade cookies. After a few weeks, the hospital called with another bill. Sarah's scans showed something, not a recurrence exactly, but a new complication. More treatment, more cost. I applied for a second job, washing dishes at a seafood restaurant during the day. It was brutal. I was constantly tired, constantly stressed, but I kept going. I stopped woodworking entirely. The tools stayed in the garage, covered in dust. The wood remained stacked in the corner. I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Every time I thought about the rocking chair, I remembered the one in that hallway and the two words etched into the wood. Don't finish. It wasn't a thought I chose to have, it just was. I saw an ad posted on the bulletin board at the casino a few weeks later. Now hiring, overnight prep cooks. The description was identical to the one I'd answered months ago, the same hourly rate, the same flexible hours. I watched Tam take down the previous posting. He didn't look at me when I asked him if it was a new ad. He just shrugged and tossed it in the trash. I haven't been back to the casino since. I found another job, stocking shelves at a grocery store. It's less money, but it's less complicated. The house is still teetering on the edge of foreclosure, but we're managing, for now. I was unloading a shipment of citrus fruit this morning, arranging the oranges in a neat pyramid, when I smelled it. Not the bright, zesty scent of the oranges, but something else, something faint, almost imperceptible, a cloying sweetness mixed with metal. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone. I didn't stop stacking oranges. I didn't look around. I just kept working.